The last hope. The winter wind howled through the mountains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of snow and the bitter taste of regret. In the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, where telegraph poles stood like scarecrows against the gray sky, most folks had already shuttered their windows and drawn close to their fires. But not everyone had the luxury of warmth. Deep beneath the sheriff's office, in a stone cell that hadn't seen sunlight in decades, Sarah McKenna lay curled on a bed of rotting straw. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, each exhale a small cloud. In the frigid air, the fever that had taken hold 3 days ago now burned through her like wildfire, and she could feel her strength ebbing away like water through cupped hands. The baby in her arms stirred restlessly. Little Thomas was barely 2 months old, his tiny face pale and pinched with cold. Sarah pulled him closer to her chest, trying to share what little warmth remained in her body. She had stopped crying days ago when the tears froze on her cheeks. Now there was only the quiet acceptance that comes when hope has been worn down to its very bones. Above her, she could hear the occasional creak of floorboards as Deputy Collins made his rounds. He had stopped bringing food 2 days ago, claiming the town council had cut off provisions for prisoners who couldn't pay their keep. Sarah had been arrested for theft, a loaf of bread and a bottle of milk she had taken to feed her son when her husband's mining wages ran out. The judge had sentenced her to 30 days. But everyone knew she would not survive that long. The cell door hadn't been opened since her fever began. Through the small barred window high on the wall, Sarah could see shadows moving back and forth, the silhouettes of townspeople going about their daily lives, unaware or uncaring that a young mother and her child were slowly dying beneath their feet. Samuel Reeves had been tracking the Donovan gang for 3 weeks, across 2 states when he rode into Cedar Ridge. His horse, a sturdy mare named Patience, picked her way carefully through the muddy main street, her hooves making soft, sucking sounds in the half-frozen ground. Samuel was a man who noticed details, the way curtains twitched when strangers passed, the quality of silence that settled over a place when secrets were being kept. He was tall and lean, with hair the color of winter wheat and eyes that had seen too much of the world's harsh truths. A weathered duster hung from his shoulders, and his hat was pulled low against the cutting wind. At his side hung a Colt revolver, well maintained but showing the wear of frequent use. He was a bounty hunter by trade, but unlike many in his profession, he had never lost his sense of right and wrong. As he tied his horse to the hitching post outside the saloon, Samuel noticed the unusual quiet that hung over the town. Even for a place as small as Cedar Ridge, there should have been more activity. Children should have been playing in the streets despite the cold, and merchants should have been calling out their wares. Instead, there was only the sound of wind, and the distant ringing of a blacksmith's hammer, inside the dusty Rose saloon. A handful of men sat hunched over their drinks, speaking in low voices that died when Samuel entered. The bartender, a heavy-set man with suspicious eyes, looked him up and down before asking what he wanted. "Whiskey," Samuel said simply, laying a coin on the scarred wooden bar. "And information." "Whiskey I got," the bartender replied, pouring a generous measure into a glass that had seen better days. "Information costs extra." Samuel sipped his drink and studied the men around him. They had the look of people carrying a collective burden, their shoulders bent with something heavier than the approaching winter. "I'm looking for the Donovan brothers," he said finally. "Word is, they passed through here about a week ago." The bartender's hands stilled on the bottle. "Might have. Lots of folks passed through. These particular folks robbed a bank in Millfield, and killed 2 people, Samuel continued, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "There's a $500 reward for information leading to their capture." One of the men at a corner table looked up sharply, then quickly back at his drink. Samuel filed away the reaction for later consideration. But before he could pursue the matter further, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. Through the saloon's grimy windows, they could see Deputy Collins arguing with an older woman in a faded blue dress. Her voice carried through the glass, high and agitated. "You can't just let them die down there, Harold Collins. That baby hasn't done anything wrong. Mind your own business." "Mrs. Henderson," the deputy shot back. "The council's made their decision." Samuel set down his glass and walked to the window for a better look. The woman, Mrs. Henderson, was pointing toward the sheriff's office with trembling fingers. "There's got to be someone in this town with a Christian heart left," she pleaded. "Someone who remembers what it means to show mercy." The deputy turned and walked away, leaving the woman standing alone in the street. She stood there for a long moment, her shoulders shaking with either cold or grief, before she too disappeared around a corner. Samuel returned to the bar where the conversation had resumed in hushed tones. He caught fragments fever, baby. Left to rot before the bartender noticed his interest and the voices quieted again. What's happening at the jail? Samuel asked directly. The bartender wiped down a glass that was already clean. Nothing. That concerns you, Mr. But the man at the corner table, the one who had reacted to mention of the reward, stood up unsteadily. He was thin and poorly dressed, with the hollow look of someone who had been hungry for a long time. My name's Peter Walsh, he said, swaying slightly. And if you're truly offering $500, I got something to tell you about them Donovan boys. The bartender shot Walsh a warning look, but the man ignored it. But first, Walsh continued, you ought to know what's happening in that jail, because if you've got any decency in you at all, you'll want to do something about it. And so, in halting, words lubricated by cheap whiskey and desperate need, Peter Walsh told Samuel about Sarah McKenna and her baby, about the bread stolen out of hunger, the 30-day sentence that had become a death warrant, and the deputy who had decided that some lives were worth less than others. The whole town knows, Walsh finished, his voice dropping to a whisper. But nobody wants to cross the council. They say if we start feeding prisoners for free, every drifter and vagrant will come here expecting a handout. Samuel listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each detail. When Walsh finished, Samuel pushed another coin across the bar. Tell me about the Donovans, he said. The information about the outlaws came quickly. Then they had indeed passed through Cedar Ridge, boasting about their exploits and spending stolen money freely. They had headed north toward the mining camps, probably planning to lose themselves in the wilderness until the heat died down. Samuel thanked Walsh and prepared to leave, but the man grabbed his arm. What about the woman and her baby? Walsh asked desperately. You can't just ride away knowing what you know. Samuel looked into the man's bloodshot eyes and saw his own conscience reflected there. No, he said quietly. I don't suppose I can. Night had fallen by the time Samuel made his way to the sheriff's office. The building was dark except for a single lamp burning in the front window. Samuel tried the door and found it unlocked. For a small town where the biggest crimes were usually drunken brawls and cattle theft, inside the office smelled of old coffee and tobacco smoke. A gun rack stood against one wall, and a desk was covered with wanted posters and official-looking papers. But it was the heavy wooden door at the back of the room that drew Samuel's attention. Above it hung a ring of iron keys, and from somewhere beyond came the faintest sound of labored breathing. Samuel took the keys and descended the narrow stone stairs that led to the jail. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time he reached the bottom, his breath was visible in small puffs. The corridor was lit by a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. There were 3 cells, but only one was occupied. In the farthest cell, Samuel found Sarah McKenna. She was so still that for a moment he feared he was too late. But then the bundle in her arms moved slightly, and he heard the weak cry of an infant. Sarah's eyes opened fever-bright and unfocused, but she seemed to sense his presence. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Take him, don't let him die because of what I did. Samuel unlocked the cell door and knelt beside her. Up close, he could see how young she was, probably not more than 20, and how the fever had ravaged her. Her lips were cracked and dry, her skin burning hot to the touch. I'm going to get you both out of here, he told her gently. Sarah tried to shake her head. Too late for me, but Thomas... he's innocent. Samuel gathered her carefully in his arms, the baby pressed between them. Sarah was frighteningly light, as if the fever had already begun to consume her from within. He carried them both up the stairs and into the main office, where he wrapped them in his own coat and the woolen blanket from the sheriff's chair. The doctor's house was 3 blocks away, marked by a small painted sign that swayed in the wind. Samuel knocked hard on the door until a gray-haired man in nightclothes appeared, grumbling about the late hour. I've got a sick woman and baby, Samuel said without preamble. They need help. Dr. Hartwell took one look at Sarah's condition and ushered them inside. His wife, a kind-faced woman named Margaret, immediately began heating water and gathering supplies. For the next several hours, Samuel sat in the doctor's kitchen while the physician worked to break Sarah's fever. Dawn was breaking when Dr. Hartwell finally emerged from the back room. His sleeves were rolled up and his hair was disheveled, but his expression was cautiously optimistic. She lived, he said simply. The fever broke an hour ago. She's weak, but with proper care and nourishment, she should recover fully. And the baby, hungry but healthy. Margaret's been feeding him goat's milk. He'll be fine. Samuel felt a weight lift from his chest that he hadn't even realized was there. What do I owe you? Dr. Hartwell waved away the question. The question is, what happens now? Once word gets out that you broke her out of jail, Deputy Collins, we'll have a warrant for your arrest. Samuel had been thinking about that very problem. Leave that to me, he said. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Samuel had barely left the doctor's house when Deputy Collins appeared at the end of the street, flanked by two other men Samuel didn't recognize. All three were armed. You're under arrest for breaking and entering and aiding a prisoner's escape, Collins called out when they were still 20 yards apart. Samuel stopped walking but made no move toward his weapon. I'm a licensed bounty hunter, he said in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. And I have information about the Donovan gang you might want to hear before you do something you'll regret. Collins hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to assert authority and his curiosity about the outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory. Talk fast, he said finally. The Donovans are holed up in an old mining camp, about 15 miles north of here, Samuel said. I can take you to them, but first, we need to settle the matter of Sarah McKenna and her son. She's a convicted thief. She's a woman who stole food to feed her baby, Samuel interrupted, and she's paid her debt to society twice over. The fever nearly killed her, and would have killed the child too if I hadn't intervened. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Samuel recognized Mrs. Henderson among them, and Peter Walsh, and several others who had the look of working people who understood what desperation could drive a person to do. The law is the law, Collins said, but his voice lacked conviction. Now, yes it is, Samuel agreed, and the law says that prisoners are entitled to food, water, and medical care. You denied all three to a nursing mother and her infant son. In my book, that makes you the criminal here. The crowd murmured agreement, and Collins found himself facing not just one man but an entire community that had been shamed into action. His two companions shifted uncomfortably, clearly having second thoughts about their support. Here's what's going to happen, Samuel continued. You're going to forget you ever saw me break into that jail. In return, I'll give you the exact location of the Donovan camp, and enough evidence to ensure they swing for what they did in Millfield. Collins considered this for a long moment while the crowd watched. Finally, he nodded curtly. The woman pays her fine and leaves town today. Fair enough, Samuel said. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The camp is marked on this map. They've got at least 3 men with them, and they're well armed. Collins took the map and studied it briefly. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, his companions trailing behind him. 3 days later, news came that the Donovan gang had been captured without a shot being fired. They had been found exactly where Samuel had said they would be, drunk and confident in their supposed safety. The reward money would be sent to Cedar Ridge within the week, but Samuel was already gone by then, riding north toward his next job. In his saddlebags were 2 extra letters, one addressed to Sarah McKenna in care of Dr. Hartwell, and another to Mrs. Henderson. Both contained enough money to ensure that neither Sarah nor her son would know hunger again, at least not for a very long time. Sarah had tried to thank him before he left, but the words had seemed inadequate for what he had done. She had offered to repay him someday, somehow, but Samuel had just shaken his head. You don't owe me anything, he had told her. Just raise that boy to be a good man. The world needs more of those. As his horse carried him up into the mountains where new challenges and old enemies waited, Samuel allowed himself a small smile. The world was full of darkness and cruelty, but it was also full of people like Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Hartwell and Margaret Peepoor, who remembered what it meant to show mercy. And sometimes, if a man was very lucky, he got to be part of bringing a little light into that darkness. Behind him, in the growing warmth of the doctor's house, Sarah McKenna held her son close and whispered promises about the future they would build together. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the town of Cedar Ridge in a blanket of pure white, a new beginning for everyone willing to accept it.